Hello, it's Joni Rotten. I'm back again with another article I want to read. This one comes from the American Journal of Psychiatry, and it is as follows. The devastating clinical consequences of child abuse and neglect, increased disease vulnerability, and poor treatment response in mood disorders. This was published in 2019, just in time for COVID. The abstract says, a large body of evidence has demonstrated that exposure to childhood maltreatment at any stage of development can have long-lasting consequences. It is associated with a marked increase in risk for psychiatric and medical disorders. This review summarizes the literature investigating the effects of childhood maltreatment on disease vulnerability for mood disorders, specifically summarizing cross-sectional and more recent longitudinal studies demonstrating that childhood maltreatment is more prevalent and is associated with the risk for first mood episode reoccurrence, greater comorbidities, and increased risk for suicidal ideation and attempts in individuals with mood disorders. It summarizes that persistent alterations associated with childhood maltreatment, including alterations in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and inflammatory cytokines, cytokines, I think is how you say that, which may contribute to disease vulnerability, a more pernicious disease course. The authors discuss several candidate genes for environmental factors, for example, substance abuse, that may alter disease vulnerability and illness course, and neurobiological associations that may mediate these relationships following childhood maltreatment. Studies provide insight into modifiable mechanisms and provide direction to improve both treatment and prevention strategies. Now, just in reading this, I have to pause for a second because there is something that I'm noticing happening. I think everyone is. There's a large amount of people that want to take their medical or mental illness and throw it on the table and let everyone know they want medicines, so they're preparing these medicines for everyone to take. They want to make mental disorders a normal part of our lives. And when they're putting out research that says these things, that it can contribute to mood disorders in the future, including schizophrenia, what we're looking at is potentially pre-crime type activities. I also remember buyer controllers. I also remember reading about the oh shoot, it just fled right out of my mind. I can't think of it now, darn it. It just left my mind. Basically, this means that, oh, I know what it was. That they had done a survey on Gen Z generation, on the Gen Z generation. And the question was to them is that, would you feel comfortable or would you allow cameras to be available in homes if it would cut down on domestic violence? And a large percentage of these children said yes. Yes, they wouldn't mind having cameras in their homes if it cut down on domestic violence. We already have cameras in our homes. We're already catching these things anyway. You can see them all over videos and TikTok and so forth and so on. But it's not, they don't have permission yet to use it against you. And what this survey tells me is that they're looking to eventually have permission to use it against you. We don't want to, this is all about the greater good. So if you can't see what's going on here when it comes from a controller type perspective, then you're missing the point. This is good news wrapped. This is bad news wrapped up in really good news. It's good news that we know this. Now we have some ideas, right? But it's bad news if the controllers are going to use it against us. It says here a little couple quotes. It is not the bruises of the body that hurt. It is the wounds of the heart that scars, and the scars on the mind. And we cannot deny our experience, but our body remembers. Some of the quotes there. It is now well established that childhood maltreatment or exposure to abuse and neglect in children under the age of 18 has devastating consequences. It's now well established. Over the past few decades, research has begun not only to define the consequences in the context of health and disease, but also to elucidate mechanisms underlying the link between childhood maltreatment and medical, including psychiatric outcomes. Research has begun to shed light on how childhood maltreatment mediates a disease risk and course. Childhood maltreatment increases risk for developing psychiatric disorders, for example, mood and anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, antisocial and borderline personality disorders, and substance use disorders. It is associated with an earlier age at onset and a more severe clinical course, greater symptom severity, and poorer treatment response to pharmacotherapy or psychotherapy. Early life adversity is also associated with increased vulnerability to several major medical disorders, including coronary artery disease and myocardial infarction, cerebral vascular disease and stroke, type 2 diabetes, asthma, and certain forms of cancer. Do you hear that? The net effect is a significant reduction in life expectancy in victims of child abuse and neglect. The focus of this review is to expand on previous reviews by synthesizing the literature and integrating much recent data, with the focus on investigating childhood maltreatment interactions with the risk for mood disorders, disease onset, and early disease heterogeneity, as well as emerging data suggesting modifiable mechanisms that could be targeted for early intervention and prevention strategies. A major emphasis of this review is to provide a clinically relevant update to practicing mental health practitioners. The prevalence and consequences of childhood maltreatment. It is estimated that 1 in 4 children will experience child abuse or neglect at some point in their lifetime. 1 in 7 children have experienced abuse over the past year. In 2016, 676,000 children were reported to Child Protect Services in the United States as identified as victims of child abuse or neglect. However, it is widely accepted that statistics on such reports represent a significant underestimate of the prevalence of childhood maltreatment because the majority of abuse and neglect goes unreported. This is especially true for certain types of childhood maltreatment, notably emotional abuse and neglect, which may never come to clinical attention but have devastating consequences on health independently of physical abuse and neglect or sexual abuse. Although rates of children being reported to Child Protective Services has remained relatively constant over recent decades, our understanding of the devastating medical and clinical consequences of childhood maltreatment have grown, and childhood maltreatment is now well established as a major risk factor for adult psychopathology. In this review, we seek to summarize the burgeoning literature on childhood maltreatment, specifically focusing on the link between childhood maltreatment and mood disorders, depression and bipolar disorder. The data converged to point towards future directions for education, prevention, and treatment to decrease the consequences of childhood maltreatment, especially in regards to mood disorders. And here we've got some figures. Childhood maltreatment increases risk for illness severity and poor treatment response in mood disorders. This is illness severity. We're talking about COVID here. The link between childhood maltreatment and risk for mood disorders and differences in disease course following illness onset have been well documented. Multiple studies have demonstrated greater rates of childhood maltreatment in patients with major depression and bipolar disorder. Indeed, a recent meta-analysis revealed that 46% of individuals with depression report childhood maltreatment. Patients with bipolar disorder also report high levels of childhood maltreatment, with estimates as high as 57%. Childhood maltreatment is associated with an increased risk in earlier onset of unipolar depression and syndromal depression, occurring on average 4 years earlier in individuals with a history of childhood maltreatment compared with those without such a history. Childhood maltreatment is also associated with more pernicious disease course. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, including a greater number of lifetime depressive disorders and greater depression severity, with the majority of studies showing more reoccurrence and greater persistence of depressive episodes. For example, in an analysis of 1,230 adults with major depressive disorder drawn from the Netherlands study of depression and anxiety, found that childhood maltreatment measured with the childhood trauma interview was associated with chronicity of depression, defined as being depressed for 24 months over the past 4 years, independent of comorbid anxiety disorders, severity of depressive symptoms, or age of onset. And remember, we've also been learning that this same study in the Netherlands has a very high concentration rate of Epstein-Barr virus in these patients. Increased risk for suicide attempts and comorbidities, including increased rates of anxiety disorders, PTSD, and substance use disorders, are reported in individuals with depression who experience childhood maltreatment. Individuals with major depressive disorder and atypical features report significantly more traumatic life events, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, and other forms of trauma. Other forms of trauma include breaking a bone, losing a pet, a divorce, ironically, which we have a huge amount of the population now with divorced parents that are now adults that had this happen when they were children. Think of the 80s. And as well as all of the over-sexualization abuse that is happening to our children. And this includes colds, this includes flus, this includes doctor visits, hospital visits, anything that is traumatic on the body, both before and after first depressive episodes, independently of sex, age of onset, or duration of depression. Additionally, childhood maltreatment has consistently been shown to be associated with poor treatment outcomes after psychotherapy, pharmacotherapy, and combined treatment. In depression, as accessed by lack of remission or response or longer time in remission. Although the studies cited above describe a link between childhood maltreatment and a more pernicious depressive course, that's going to bug me if they're going to keep using that word, that I can't pronounce it smoothly. So let me see if I can remedy this. Here. Is it pernicious? Pernicious? Pernicious. Pernicious? That's not helping me. Pernicious, pernicious. If you know the correct way, phonetically spell it out for me in the comments. That would be great. Um, most studies have been cross-sectional, and the possibility of recall bias and mood effects owing to the retrospective investigation of childhood maltreatment in individuals who are currently depressed cannot be ruled out. How this also makes me think of in generational cycles, how they are well aware because they wrote it in the book that we have overprotected, underprotected, overprotected, underprotected. So you have this cycle that happens with the children of their generation. And what appears to be an overprotection currently is a massive underprotection as we're trying to overprotect our children by, you know, giving them medicines and taking them to the doctor and checking every flu and thing that is happening. We're actually underprotecting them. We're allowing them to be used as guinea pigs over and over again. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's see here. Where was I? Right here. However, studies over the past few years comparing retrospective and prospective measurement of childhood maltreatment suggest consistency between retrospective reports and prospective designs. Although a recent meta-analysis suggested poor agreement between these measures, with better agreement observed when retrospective measures were based on interviews and in studies with smaller samples. Longitudinal and prospective studies are emerging that have further confirmed and extended our understanding of the devastating consequences of childhood maltreatment and on illness course. Ellis et al. Recently reported that childhood maltreatment increased risk for more severe trajectories of depressive symptoms during a 7-year longitudinal study in 243 adolescents at the Argonne Adolescent Development Study. And we'll check that study out later as well. They reported that childhood maltreatment increased the risk for recurrent depressive episodes and suicidal ideation by 2030 during a 3-year follow-up of 2,497 participants diagnosed with major depressive disorder and National Epidemiology chop that one up, didn't I? Survey on alcohol and related conditions, or for short, NESARC. Additionally, Wyndham, in a study that followed a cohort of 676 children with documented childhood maltreatment and compared risk for depression in adulthood, between them and a cohort of 520 children matched on age, race, sex, and family social class who were not exposed to childhood maltreatment, found a clear association between childhood maltreatment and both increased risk for depression and early onset of the disorder. Although more research has been reported investigating the link between childhood maltreatment and disease onset. Are you getting colds, cancer, depression, fibromyalgia? And course in unipolar depression, more recent evidence supports the link between childhood maltreatment and disease onset and course in bipolar disorder. Childhood maltreatment is associated with increased disease vulnerability, COVID-19, and earlier age of onset and bipolar disorders. Janssen sought, and I know that name's a pharmaceutical company. Janssen sought to determine whether childhood maltreatment mediated the effect of family history on diagnosis of a mood disorder. The findings indicated that 1/3 of the effect of the family history on risk for mood disorders was mediated by childhood maltreatment. As with depression, studies on bipolar disorder with a prospective or longitudinal approach are few but very informative. Using data from the NESARC, Gilman found that childhood physical and sexual abuse were associated with increased risk for first onset, recurrent mania independent of recent life stress. Think of what we have going on right now. So much sexual abuse going on and physical abuse. And I'm not talking about a bully. I'm talking about doctors. I'm talking about libraries, in schools, in association, places that are supposed to be keeping our children safe. An association between childhood maltreatment and prodromal symptoms has also been reported in bipolar disorder, suggesting that childhood maltreatment may contribute to a disease vulnerability before onset of the first manic episode. Childhood maltreatment in the context of bipolar disorder is associated with a more pernicious disease course, including greater frequency and severity of mood episodes, both depressive and manic, greater severity of psychosis symptoms, and greater risk for comorbidities. That means that in the future, we are going to have an uptick because of the children that are currently being affected by these abuses. In our future, we are going to see more anxiety disorders, more PTSD, more substance use disorders, more rapid cycling, more inpatient hospitalizations, more suicide attempts. This will only get worse because it is not getting any better. So in the next 20 years, we can expect to see this in the generation that's coming of age, especially if we keep having colds and flus hit everyone, because they are a trigger point, as we have learned many times over already. Studies are beginning to emerge investigating treatment response in bipolar disorder following childhood maltreatment. Such studies remain few, but they suggest that childhood maltreatment is associated with a poor response to benzodiazepines. Is that how you say that? And anticonvulsants in bipolar disorder. Look at that. You get a poor response when you have this in play. Look at the pharmaceutical companies are drooling. The concatenation of findings in depression and bipolar disorder are concordant in that childhood maltreatment increases risk for and early onset of the first mood episode and episode reoccurrence. Childhood maltreatment affects disease trajectories, including in its association with more insidious mood episodes, poor treatment response, a greater risk for comorbidities, and a greater risk for suicide ideation, attempts, and completion. The link between childhood maltreatment. Why are we having an uptick in child suicide? Attempts, ideation, and completion. Why are these going up? Well, we have some ideas. Why did it skyrocket during the flu? Because the flu triggers. The link between childhood maltreatment and increased prevalence of suicide-related behaviors is of particular importance, given the high rate of suicide ideation attempts and completion in depression and bipolar disorder. Despite many prevention strategies, for example, education and outreach and clinical studies to identify the risk factors for impending suicide attempts in individuals with mood disorders, suicide rates have not decreased, but in fact increased in the United States. Why is that? Joni had some ideas. The link between childhood maltreatment and suicide rate behavior has been reviewed by several groups. This one reported that, here it is. This one reported that adverse childhood experiences, including childhood maltreatment, increased the risk for suicide attempts twofold to fivefold in 17,337 adults in the now classic adverse childhood experiences study. This Gomez reported that physical or sexual abuse increased the odds of suicide ideation, planning, and attempts among 9,272 adolescents in the U.S. National Comorbidity Study, Adolescent Supplement. Miller examined the relationship between childhood maltreatment and prospective suicide ideation in a cohort of 682 youths followed over a 3-year period. Emotional maltreatment prediction suicide ideation independently of previous suicide ideation and depressive symptoms severity. Childhood maltreatment, I think I read that. Let me try this sentence again because it was not right. Emotional maltreatment predicted suicide ideation independently of previous suicide ideation and depressive symptom severity. Childhood maltreatment is also associated with earlier age of first suicide attempt. Additionally, an association between childhood maltreatment and suicide risk in 449 individuals aged 60 or older was recently reported from the multidimensional study of the elderly in the Family Health Strategy in Brazil. The effect was independent of depressive symptom severity. These findings suggest that childhood maltreatment increases risk for suicide related behavior across the lifespan. More work is warranted in investigating the biological mechanisms that may mediate the association between childhood maltreatment and suicide related behaviors. And that work is being done currently with AI that is watching everyone and recording everyone. You are a number. You might not be a name yet, but you are a number, and they're watching you, as well as the numerous amount of parents taking their children to doctors and putting them on medications that are experimental. How much trauma is that causing to the body? Anyone who has been misdiagnosed with something and given a medication that had adverse effects due to that misdiagnosis knows full well what happens when these take place. Timing of childhood maltreatment. Are there periods of heightened sensitivity? And this is going to bring me back to 9/11. Although childhood maltreatment at any age can result in long-lasting consequences, there is evidence that the timing, duration, and severity of the maltreatment mediate the risk for later psychopathology. Childhood maltreatment that occurs earlier in life and continues for longer duration is associated with the worst outcomes. This is supported by preclinical models, rodent and non-human primate, that investigate maternal separation. And let's just note that this is what is called, I've recently been studying this, thanks to Ulick, vivisection, where animals are being used for medical experiments, these being some of them. A paradigm more similar to neglect in human. One study in rodents found that maternal separation during early postnatal period, days 2 to 15, hospitals that just take the baby, right, 2 to 15. Well, usually you're home, I think, by day 2. But still, think of how hospitals are running, where the baby is put into the nursery and the mother is only seeing them a few hours during the day. You need your rest. The baby needs to rest. We separate babies immediately now. I wonder what studies study that, research that. But not the later postnatal days, 7 through 20, is associated with anxious and depressive-like behaviors in adulthood. So it doesn't even show up until they are adults. Although this postnatal period coincides with with in utero developments in humans, there is evidence that in utero results in the form of stress can have consequences similar to early life trauma, supporting the translational validity of these models. So stress on the mother in utero can equal stress on the baby in the fetus. Clinical studies also support the importance of timing of childhood maltreatment in moderate risk for psychopathology. Kowal investigated the timing and duration of childhood maltreatment in 223 maltreated children between the ages of 3 and 9, and found that children who were maltreated during infancy and those who experienced chronic maltreatment had poor inhibitory control and working memory. Look what they created in an adult. They investigated the relationship between timing of childhood maltreatment and depression and suicidal ideation in early adulthood among 15,701 participants in the National Longitude Study of Adolescent Health, and found that exposure to early maltreatment, especially during the preschool years between ages 3 and 5, was the most strongly associated with depression. So now I ask myself as I pause here, when we have preschool children in a daycare center, and there are around 20 other preschool children, age 3, age 2, age 1, biting, scratching, attacking each other as babies do, in daycare centers with very little adult intervention, set in cribs for hours upon hours during the day to keep them from. Have you ever been in a daycare or a preschool center? I suggest you call one up, pretend that you are a parent wanting to put your child in their center, and do what they call a tour. And look, and while you're looking, ask yourself questions. How long are these children in here? Look at how many kids are crawling on the floor. Look at how many 3-year-olds are in a room with 1 and only 2 adults in most cases, depending on your location. Montessori schools are notorious for having very low child-teacher ratio, high child-teacher ratio. So they have a lot of teachers per amount of children. So they might have, say, 6 children for 1 teacher. But in lower income areas, you might have 1 teacher for 10 babies. You might have 1 teacher for 10 toddlers. That's a lot of toddlers to be running around. You have 20 toddlers and 2 adults in the room. And then consider what happens when they move into schools and you have, a classroom of 30, 5-year-olds and only 2 teachers. And that means that those 5-year-olds are around other 5-year-olds. They're 5-year-olds raising 5-year-olds. They're not having that dynamic of multiple aged groups like we did in earlier generations. And I believe, and as I have predicted, and I am now reading, there is a strong association, and we are going to end up, as we're moving into our adulthood, the children that are been forced into schools and daycare centers and preschools from 6 weeks, we are now seeing an uptick of what? Psychiatric disorders amongst adults and their children as well, because it's generationally linked through our genetics. And this problem isn't going to get better. It's going to get worse. Unbelievable. So we clearly need to go back to more loving homes, staying at home, not putting our children in schools. Additionally, sex abuse occurs during early childhood compared with adolescence, was reported to be more strongly associated with suicidal ideation. And what are we having en masse? Transhumanism, which is nothing but the sexual abuse of children. While these studies suggest that childhood maltreatment that occurs earlier in development may further increase risk of developing mood disorders and associated behaviors in adulthood, it is important to emphasize that evidence suggests that exposure to maltreatment during later childhood and adolescence also independently increase risks for mood disorders. Emotional abuse and neglect, especially if it occurs between the ages of 8 and 9, increases depressive symptoms. And what age are they going after? Look at that. My God, that's so horribly horrible. I mean, I'm actually blown away at the beauty of it, and yet I'm totally grotesque. I'm grossed out by the negligence of those in charge who are failing to even see, from their own research. And as I have said before, this is old research. I know they're trying to tell me that it is new, but I've been reading about this and talking about this for at least 10 years now. So it's definitely been out there. Emotional abuse during adolescence also increases risk for depression. More work is emerging investigating the negative consequences of bullying. More work being all of the studies that are coming out now. As you see, that's en masse. A study of 1,420 participants aged 9 to 16 revealed that victims of bullying showed an increased prevalence of generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and suicide-related behavior. A recent study of more than 5,000 children that comprised a longitudinal data set, and here's the name of that, found an increased risk for mental health problems, including anxiety, depression, and self-harm in individuals who experienced bullying, not other maltreatment, but not other maltreatment, so just in bullying. Additionally, an association between childhood bullying by peers and risk for suicide-related behaviors and ideation, planning, attempting, and onset plan among ideators, independent of childhood maltreatment by adults, was reported in a sample of the U.S. Army soldiers. Wow, in a sample of U.S. Army soldiers. So basically, what it sounds to me like is the era of the bully, which again, that is caused by children being raised by children with very little older and adult supervision. I'm not saying that it's not always been there. We've always had bullying, but just consider what the generations are experiencing in these bullying right now, bullying a child because they won't use a correct pronoun, and that's by an adult. Some studies suggest that differential periods of sensitivity to different subtypes of maltreatment are distinctly associated with an increased risk for mood disorders. Distinctly. Recently, a strong relationship was reported between adult depression and early childhood sexual abuse occurring at age 5 or earlier, and later childhood physical abuse occurring at age 13 or later, compared with maltreatment that occurred during other developmental periods. I find that fascinating. Remember, your age, the age you are, is specific. There are certain developmental things that are happening in the body and in the brain during specific periods of our development, on point. And you can use trauma or traumatic events at specific ages to unlock things. You've heard me say this so many times, and there it is yet again. Harper reported that early childhood maltreatment between birth and age 4 predicted more anxiety symptoms, and maltreatment that occurred in late childhood or early adolescent between 10 and 12 predicted more depressive symptoms of adolescence. Taken together, these studies suggest that maltreatment at any age and across different contexts, physical and emotional, familial, and peer-induced, often result in long-lasting and severe consequences, and that there may be specific sensitive periods in development when exposure to distinct types of maltreatment may differentially increase risk for affective disorders in adulthood. And that again reminds me of that study that I had learned back about people with Ehlers-Danlos being followed not just when they got ill, but also when they broke a bone, when their dog died, when their parents divorced, when grandma died, when they moved to a new place. All of these things being marked every time it happened with age-specific locations in the timeline, equaling what they were looking for in the future so that they could be prepared, this pharmaceutical company, for what pharmaceutical illnesses they can make medicines for. To date, the majority of research investigating the impact of childhood maltreatment timing on illness risk and course in mood disorders has focused on depression. One study reported that early sexual or physical abuse before the age of 11 in 225 early psychosis patients, that's 6.7 with a bipolar disorder diagnosis, coincide with lower scores on the Global Assessment of Functioning Scale and the Social and Occupational Functioning Assessment Scale during a 3-year follow-up period, whereas late sexual or physical abuse between ages 12 and 15 did not. How interesting is that? More work, of course, investigating timing of maltreatment and associated clinical outcomes is warranted. Why? Because we want to make medicines for them. We'll use this. Experiencing single subtypes of abuse and neglect versus experiencing multiple subtypes. Several groups have sought to determine the impact of single type of childhood maltreatment on mood disorders. Although all types of childhood maltreatment, physical, emotional, and sexual, increase disease vulnerability and risk for more severe illness course in mood disorders, including increased risk for suicide, there may be some distinctions between individual subtypes and associated outcomes. An association between sexual abuse and lifetime risk for anxiety disorders, depression, and suicide attempts independent of other types of maltreatment have been reported. In bipolar disorder, physical abuse and sexual abuse independently increase the risk for illness vulnerability, and more severe course. One study of 446 youths aged 7 to 17 found that physical abuse was independently associated with a longer duration of illness in bipolar disorder, a greater prevalence of comorbid PTSD and psychosis, and a greater prevalence of family history of mood disorders when compared with sexual abuse, which was only associated with a greater prevalence of PTSD. Isn't that interesting? Research life stress in adulthood was found to increase risk for first onset mania in individuals with a history of childhood physical maltreatment, but not in individuals with a history of sexual maltreatment. However, it should be noted that early life sexual abuse in the study was a strong risk factor for mania, even if the absence of a recent life stress. Neglect is the least studied form of early life adversity, and emerging data suggests differential consequences following neglect as compared with abuse. Similarly, long-lasting consequences following emotional maltreatment, independently of other forms of maltreatment, have also been reported. In a 2015 meta-analysis, emotional abuse showed the strongest association with depression, followed by neglect and sexual abuse. A finding reported by another recent meta-analysis. Meta-analysis, what does that mean? This person, whoever this was, Spertus, they reported that emotional abuse and neglect predicted depressive symptoms even after controlling for physical and sexual abuse. further suggesting emotional abuse and neglect to be independently related to illness severity and depression. Pre perinatal, right? Perinatal verbal aggression was found to increase risk for depression and anxiety in adolescents, with risk suggested to be greater following verbal aggression compared with physical abuse. Kahn recently reported that nonverbal emotional abuse in males and peer emotional abuse in females are important predictors. They're important predictors of a lifetime history of major depression and are more predictive than number of types of maltreatment experienced. Another recent meta-analysis reported that an individual with depression, emotional neglect with the most common report form of childhood maltreatment and emotional abuse, was most closely related to symptom severity. High prevalence of emotional maltreatment is also reported in bipolar disorder, approximately 40%, with emotional maltreatment associated with disease vulnerability and more severe illness course, including rapid cycling, comorbid anxiety and stress disorders, suicide attempts or ideology, and cannabis use. Although studies on subtypes of maltreatment are only now burgeoning, they are concordant in implicating emotional maltreatment in addition to physical and sexual maltreatment, in increasing risk for and differences in disease course of mood disorders. Emotional maltreatment and neglect are clearly the least studied of all forms of childhood adversity. This is in part because they are often overlooked and least likely to come to clinical attention as compared with physical or sexual abuse, which can, of course, result in physical injury. Because emotional maltreatment and neglect are likely the most prevalent forms of childhood maltreatment in psychiatric populations, and given findings suggesting that independent of other forms of maltreatment, emotional maltreatment has long-lasting consequences that increase risk for mood disorders and illness outcomes, and more research on the road of emotional maltreatment and neglect are urgently needed. And again, I'm just hearing school. I'm just hearing daycare centers and school. The best parents with the best intentions and the most loving are throwing their kids to the wolves. And then you put into account the soccer mom phenomenon of the 2000s, and and the busing kids from here to there, meeting this requirement and that requirement, and very little time for parents to interact in loving ways. And then of course you add Game Boys and TVs and bedrooms and so forth and so on, and you have a lot of neglected, loved but neglected children, overindulged children, spoiled, rotten children. That is a form of maltreatment that is about to come of age and take over the world. Just think about that for a second. Although findings described above suggest the hypothesis that different subtypes of early life adversity may independently increase risk for mood disorders, and that some subtypes may be more closely related to specific differences in illness course and severity, it is clear that subtypes of abuse and neglect, as a rule, do not occur in isolation, but instead occur together in the same individual. For example, individuals experiencing physical or sexual abuse likely also experience emotional maltreatment, and some studies have investigated the impact of multiple types of childhood maltreatment. A recent meta-analysis again reported that 19% of individuals with major depression report more than one form of childhood maltreatment, and while all childhood maltreatment subtypes have been shown to increase the risk of depression, experiencing multiple forms of childhood maltreatment further elevates this risk. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study provided evidence of an additive effect of 8 early life stress events, including abuse, but also other early life stressors, such as divorce, domestic violence, household substance abuse, and parental loss, as you've heard Joni say multiple times. On adult psychopathology, so in other words, when they were kids, this is what we got as adults. Specifically, individuals with 4 or more early life stress events have significantly increased risk for depression. Let me also add to this list other life stressors such as divorce, domestic violence, household substance abuse, parental loss, the flu, 9/11, terrorists, war. I don't know, name a few. Just throw them out there. Those are just the couple that we've had here recently. Violence on TV, transhumanism movements, apocalyptic ending, world ending, fear of the TV, and news fear mongering. In an additive or cumulative effect of early life stress on increased risk for mood, anxiety, and substance use disorders has also been reported by others. Multiple adverse childhood experiences, maltreatment, plus other forms of stressful events also result in higher rates of comorbidities. Likewise, a dose response relationship between the number of types of childhood maltreatment and illness severity and bipolar disorder have been suggested, including increased risk for comorbid anxiety disorders and substance use disorders. This is a very long paper, so I think I'm going to end it here. I think you get the idea. I might break it up because I struggle to keep my vision the longer I stare, because I happen to have some problems due to some of the things I've mentioned. The longer I stare at this, the more my eyes start to blur and the harder it is for me to read the words. So I'm going to leave it here at almost an hour here with this article. I find this fascinating, interesting, and very telling. It's validating as well. So think about it. The link to this is in the description. I'm not sure if you can actually follow the link because you have to do some kind of verification, but all you have to do is type in the title of this and you will find it. And you can read through it yourself and share this to others. I'll break it down into smaller segments when I get my channel back. And that way it'll be easier to follow along and maybe more people will pay attention. Thanks to those that listen to me. It's very good what we're learning.